Okay, everybody. Hello and welcome. Thanks very much for joining this AFN Network Plus webinar on world building and behaviour change, how to make healthy and sustainable diets the easy choice. So I'm Jess Fredenberg and I will be your chair today. I'm based at the School of Environmental Sciences at the University of East Anglia, where I'm the Knowledge Exchange Fellow for the AFN Network Plus. If you don't know about AFN, this is your first webinar with us, just to let you know, we're a UKRI funded project focused on identifying research gaps that could help reduce emissions in the UK agri-food system. We've got around 2,000, nearly 2,500 members now across the UK, so join if you haven't already. I will put a link in the chat shortly. So also with me today is Professor Neil Ward, who co-leads AFN, also based at UEA, and our two speakers, Lauren Leake-Smith and Ed Wincup. Ed, I have to check whether I've pronounced your name right, actually. Should have done that before. I'll be introducing them in a minute, but just a few words on today's topic, really. So if you agreed with the dominant political messaging of the last few years, then you'd say that individual responsibility is the main reason we're all, as a nation, overweight, unhealthy, and eating unsustainable diets. The narrative goes that people are uneducated around food, they don't know how to cook, manage their money, they're sort of irresponsible in some sort of way. But there's a growing recognition that our environment, the shops and food available in our neighbourhoods, the advertising we see, how different foods are costed and displayed, etc., that actually this is the main driver of dietary habits. And as the recent House of Lords Food, Diet and Obesity Committee stated a few weeks ago in a big report, all income groups now fail to meet dietary recommendations. This is not because of a collective loss of willpower. So this is hugely important because we know that we have to collectively change our diets to reduce emissions and come back within planetary boundaries. So our understanding of what can create that shift has really big implications, not least for government policy, particularly given the NHS's new mission to move towards prevention of ill health. So this all begs the question, how then do we move from placing all our bets on individual behavioural change and individual responsibility to building a world where healthy and sustainable diets are the easy and normal choice for everyone, regardless of location, income, and any cultural factors? How can political discourse be encouraged towards leadership and action on all of this? So we've got two really good speakers who are going to dive into this for us. They are Lauren Leake-Smith and Ed Wincup, as I said, both senior advisors in the Energy, Environment and Sustainability team at an organisation called the Behavioural Insights team. So you might have heard of BIT before. It was originally established as a research unit within the UK government and is now an independent consultancy working on behavioural change globally. So a little bit more about Lauren. Lauren has a background in applied behavioural science, leading projects across energy, environmental, consumer and business policy. She's previously had roles at Ofgem in their behavioural insights unit, and she has an MSc in psychology and a BSc in marketing management. Ed leads projects across a range of policy areas in the UK and internationally, including on sustainable diets, food waste, transport, energy use, energy efficiency, and public acceptability relating to net zero policies. So all very relevant to what we're talking about today. Ed also holds an MSc in business and organisational psychology and a BSc or BSc or B, I'm not quite sure which, on psychology. So Lauren and Ed, if you would like to get your slides ready, then I will pass over to you. Just so that everybody's aware, we will be having, as usual, a kind of 30-minute Q&A at the end. So if you've got questions as we go along, please write them in the Q&A box and feel free to have a chat in the actual chat box. But it will make it much easier to find your questions later if you can put any questions for our panel in the Q&A box and leave everything else for the chat. So I will hand over to Ed and Lauren. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Jez, and good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for taking an hour out of your Wednesday morning to hear about behaviour change and the systems approach. I think Jez has done a really good intro, so I won't spend too much kind of taking us through this, but just maybe to recap, really our ambition for today is to set out a case for why promoting uptake of sustainable diets doesn't just sit at the level of the individual consumer. Instead, we'll explore behaviour change levers across the system that can make sustainable diets the easy, accessible, affordable and socially normative option. So just to give you a bit of an overview about kind of what we'll take you through in the next 20-25 minutes or so, we'll provide a little bit of context about who we are, although Jez has already kind of very kindly covered a lot of that, and walk you through briefly what really we mean by behavioural insights and how we can apply behavioural insights to help kind of set the context for today's conversation. Ed's then going to kind of walk you through our thought leadership on system-wide levers to promote sustainable diets. And then I'll wrap us up with a few case studies to kind of imagine what, I guess, an ideal world would look like that promotes sustainable diets across some of those behaviour change interventions and at different levels of the system that we walk you through today. So just very briefly about us, we've already introduced ourselves. So my name's Laurenique Smith, joined by my colleague Ed Wincup. We're both senior policy advisors at the Behavioural Insights team. We've been between us there between 3.5 to 4 years each, and have walked you through kind of our previous background prior to BIT to date. In terms of BIT, we are an applied research and innovation consultancy specialising in social and behaviour change. We were the first so-called nudge unit set up globally to apply behavioural insights to improving policy and social impact outcomes. We now have 9 offices globally with over 250 staff. We've run over 1,500 projects to date, including 800 trials. We have over 60 academic publications, and we've worked across almost 80 countries. And just to add a bit of flavour to the types of partners we've worked with, you can see that across the screen, we've partnered with organisations from the public sector, the third sector, and the private sector. So what is behavioural insights? Well, we define it in terms of 3 main components. We ultimately here are to design or apply and combine a deep understanding of human behaviour and evidence-led problem solving to design the better policies and public services. And we do that across three elements. So behavioural insights, it first ultimately at its core is about evidence on behaviour. So focusing on the insights from disciplines such as psychology and behavioural economics. The second point, which is really important to us, is the practical application. So really going beyond that theoretical focus to think about how we can develop interventions and services that can support people to make better choices about themselves and also improve existing policies and services. I know, well, hopefully we'll set out today that behaviour is inherently complex and we cannot be certain that interventions will work. So wherever possible, we certainly have a focus on evaluating and testing through experimentation and randomised controlled trials. And these evaluations in turn increase our understanding of what drives human behaviour and what are effective ways for promoting positive behaviour change. Now, behavioural insights, if you are familiar at all with the term, it's often sort of combined or inherently sort of linked to nudge theory, but want to just recognise up front before we get into the depths of sustainable diets that really we can apply BI across several different levers. And ultimately, behavioural insights is not there to replace existing levers, but ultimately there to kind of complement and enhance it. So starting on the left, we can apply BI to comms and information, such as highlighting social norms or having clear call to action. We can then apply BI to the design of environments where BI can inform how choices are presented, including what is the default choice, such as in a food supermarket, or how choices are set out in online environments to make certain choices more likely. Behavioural insights can also inform redesigning processes, such as identifying bottlenecks and where you can remove friction, such as reducing the number of steps or choices in a process. Furthermore, incentives can also be improved by behavioural insights. For example, how and when people are rewarded and what rewards are used for. And finally, behavioural insights can be applied at the policy and regulatory level to make existing rules and guidance more effective. Regulators can ensure that competition runs smoothly and goes with the grain of human behaviour, such as making prices comparable, making switching between suppliers easier, prompting consumers to make timely choices, etc. So where does BI fit into sustainable diets? I'm sure everyone in this audience is aware that the food sector contributes a significant amount to the UK's emissions. When we look at including imported foods, it contributes to over a third of UK emissions. So behavioural insights can be used alongside some of the existing levers I just introduced to help reduce the food sector's emissions by, at a very high level, promoting sustainable diets, reducing food waste, and supporting sustainable agriculture and biosecurity. And to deliver a lot of this, we need to ultimately influence behaviour. And to reassure you, it's not just us saying this. The Climate Change Committee acknowledged that reaching net zero heavily depends on widespread behaviour change and effective public engagement. According to the committee and their Balanced Pathway to Net Zero report, over half of emissions cuts depends on adoption of clean heating, electric vehicles, smarter technologies, and home energy efficiency improvements. And 9% requires further lifestyle behaviours, including consuming less meat and dairy, more active society, use of public transport, fewer flights, and less waste. So hopefully that kind of sets the scene for what we mean by behavioural insights. I'm now going to hand you over to Ed, who will walk you through some of our systems thinking.
Thanks very much, Lauren. And just to say, pleasure to be speaking today. Great to see so many attendees on this call. So as Lauren mentioned, what I'm going to lay out is essentially the viewpoint that we should look beyond the individual consumer, as past interventions have traditionally leaned towards, and open up our view to looking more so at the system that surrounds the individual. And it's through that lens that really we can start thinking about achieving larger scale change when it comes to our diets, and certainly in terms of achieving our sustainability outcomes in relation to those. So starting out with a bit of a positive on this slide, fundamentally, we know that the public in the UK welcome and want to make greener choices, more sustainable choices in their lives. So we know that 88% would like to make more sustainable choices if they could, but also 88% do feel like this is a difficult task and arduous thing to do because of the existing barriers that exist. So some of these barriers, just to name a few, are high cost, convenience, limited knowledge, but of course there's many, many others. And in parallel to that, what we also know is that 86% do hope that leadership on environment was stronger from both government and business. And further to that, they would also like government and business to do more to help them with their sustainable choices. So just to recap, there's an appetite there for more sustainable choices. People recognize that this is hard, and there is a general mandate there for change, for more support to enable more sustainable choices. So overall, a positive message. And I should just quickly note that this is polling data from our own internal experiments with the general public. This particular data comes from 2022. So just noting that because it is something that is subject to shift, obviously, over the years. If we just go to the next slide, please, Lauren. When we start digging more into those behaviours and what people think about certain behaviours, pro-environmental behaviours, I mean, what we find is that people's perceptions of what is impactful isn't always entirely accurate. And you can see that shown in this graphic on the slide. Particularly wanted to call out, in terms of rated impact, in the top right-hand side there you can see recycling as being quite a high impact behaviour. At least that's how it's rated generally by the general public. And then we find actual higher impact actions. There's a cluster of those in the middle of the graphic there. For instance, eating less meat and dairy are tended to be rated in terms of being lower impact. And so there's obviously clearly here misperceptions among the public. And I think what this really shows and illustrates this finding and this data is that there is a cap and a ceiling to what public communications, information provision, changing people's perceptions and beliefs can do. There's been widespread campaigns, widespread communication, and of course you could argue that those could be more coordinated, improved. But certainly there is a wealth of information that has been put towards the consumer and the public on the impact of certain behaviors, yet we still see these misperceptions as being quite prevalent. And so that starts to raise the question, what else can be done? What other levers can we start pulling beyond just this information provision approach? And I just wanted to mention that I'm not saying that there isn't a place for that type of intervention. I think that there is still potentially a lot of good that can do. And I would argue, for instance, from my own experience in terms of doing primary research with the general public, that there are still very big gaps in terms of people's understanding of diet and environmental impact. And that's something that you see quite often. And so, yes, some comms can go away in recalibrating that awareness. But there is certainly a cap to that. And to further that point, if we move to the next slide, please, Lauren, it's important to also look at people's willingness to make specific changes and willingness to actually take up certain behaviors. Before going into the specific data points here, what I wanted to mention is that essentially we are looking here at willingness, or in other words, stated intent to carry out behaviors. And that is very different to actual behavior. So that seems obvious, but the key thing here to mention is that actually what people say they will do, which often aligns with their attitudes and beliefs, doesn't necessarily correlate with how they actually will behave. In the behavioral science literature, we refer to that phenomenon as the intention-action gap. And the reason for that gap is, I mean, there's many reasons, but one of those reasons is hypothetically, yeah, we agree with carrying out these series of sustainable behaviors. But when it comes to actually carrying them out in practice, there are a wealth of barriers that actually prohibit us from carrying those out. Some of those barriers affect the individual, but some of those, of course, are wider and are symptomatic of the system. And just to sort of illustrate that point a bit further, you can just look at these specific behaviors. And by the way, just on that intention-action gap and the fact that we're looking at willingness here, you might look at these figures and think, for instance, on the far right there, eating less meat and dairy, 59% of people willing to do that. That actually seems quite high. But just to stress that when we're talking about willingness, we should always factor that as sort of an upper bound of behavior in terms of the more optimistic scenario, given what I just mentioned there around the intention-action gap. But just to sort of unpack this a bit further, what we can see here is that people tend to believe that lower impact actions are the ones that they're more willing to carry out. So here we have, for instance, in the top left quadrant, recycling, we have repair and reuse, we even have eating seasonal foods, which is a positive, of course. And I guess it's hard to identify, there's specific barriers to all of these different behaviors, but what I would point out as a common thread between these is they're all relatively easy to carry out. They all align with our financial motives, and they're all backed by a system that enables these behaviors. A good example of that is recycling, for instance. Even when we unpack eating seasonal food, we can look at that, and when food is in season, when produce is in season, that's more accessible. So it might be more salient to us when we go into our local shops and we notice that. And it's usually cost advantageous to go with seasonal produce as well versus potentially non-seasonal alternatives, which might be more expensive. So there's a bit of alignment there. Now, when we look at the high impact actions, which generally people are less willing to take, again, it's difficult to identify a common theme here because they're all very different behaviors, certainly with things like heat pump adoption, EV adoption, very large scale financial barriers in place there. But when we zoom into eating less meat and dairy again there are some very social and normative barriers there to reducing meat intake. One of the key things and idiosyncrasies actually of eating less meat and dairy is that people view that choice as being very personally driven, personally motivated and intrinsically driven. So whenever we perceive that to be under threat, people trying to nudge us in certain directions or changing that choice, it's natural that people see that and almost perceive it as an infringement of their freedoms, and they react in the way they do. Either that's with ambivalence or potentially even with negative emotions in response, which isn't what you want. And of course, there are many other barriers to eating less meat and dairy, which I'll touch on in a moment as well. But I think what this slide really shows is that ultimately there are limits to informing the public. You could argue that, yes, if people were more aware of the impact of certain behaviors, maybe their beliefs, perceptions might change. But ultimately, the intention-action gap does mean that there is need for further consideration of other levers for behavior change outside of those by targeting the individual. So that takes us to the next slide, where really what we want to do is outline our view of how system-wide behavior change occurs. And this is the upstream downstream model of behavior change. Now, just to say, this is a very simplified view of any system. It's really made to make the point. And I think what it's really quite useful for doing is understanding the numerous actors that operate within a given system. And then what's also very interesting, once you have a sense of the actors, understanding, as I say, the intervention or policy levers that are at our disposal for encouraging behavior change. The model itself has 3 key levels. So starting from the bottom, which is downstream, this is typically, or in many cases, downstream refers to the consumer, the general public, the wider group of people we are trying to change the behavior of. And as I said earlier, the things that we can change at a downstream level, plausibly, are people's preferences, people's knowledge, values, biases, and all of those things, as I say, are definitely worth addressing, but we need to be cognizant of the fact that the change that we can expect in terms of behavior is going to be limited. And actually, if we want to start thinking about widespread behavior change at scale, then we need to start thinking about midstream and upstream level interventions. Midstream refers to essentially what we in the behavioral science field refer to as the choice architecture, which is essentially how choices are presented to us and are offered to us. And so these involve particular interventions, for instance, around pricing, around convenience, salience, things like social norms as well. And I'm going to provide a couple of examples of those in a moment, by the way. And then we have obviously the upstream level, which is at the very top. And that's when we're starting to think about regulation. We're starting to think about investment, incentives, disincentives, etc. And what the behavioral science literature does tell us overall is that when you intervene at these higher levels, further upstream, that is what's going to have a significant change in behavior. It's going to have those cascading effects intuitively to a wider scale of people. And that's how you achieve wider scale behavior change. If we just go to the next slide, we've slightly adapted our model for the purposes of this presentation to the sustainable diet system. Again, this is a very simplified version, so apologies for that. It's just to illustrate how the model can be used to start identifying some of the specific actors that we might target with our interventions, as well as starting to think about the interventions themselves. So at the downstream level, for instance, one example of a solution here could be, as I mentioned earlier, people might not have a good sense of what the impacts on the environment are from altering our diets. So maybe there is some worthwhile in actually creating some sort of campaign to specifically address that. And that's an example of something that might happen downstream. It might change people's levels of awareness and understanding. But as I said earlier, that might not necessarily relate to actual behavior change. When we look at midstream, there are a couple of different actors here to be cognizant of. So we have farmers, we have distributors, we have producers, but also retailers, supermarkets, hospitality. Particularly those actors that have a direct interface with the public are the ones that offer, the greatest scope for direct intervention. And here a possible solution to consider is, for instance, the use of standardized carbon labeling for supermarket products, which is something that's been spoken a lot about, it's been explored, and something that we've done a bit of research into when it comes to carbon labeling generally. And then you get to obviously the upstream level. This is when you start talking about Her Majesty's Government, you start thinking about, for instance, specific agencies. And an example here, a really neat example actually of an intervention at this level is the sugar tax on soft drinks, so the soft drink levy, which was introduced, which necessitated reformulation that was targeted at business as opposed to the consumer. And so what that meant is it resulted in large-scale reformulation of soft drink products, reducing the quantities of sugar content in soft drinks. And it's a really nice example of how an upstream sort of intervention can have widespread changes in terms of changing the market itself rather than consumer behavior directly. So that's just a bit about the model. I just wanted to finish this section with, I guess, a bit of a caveat, because I think I've been slightly negative towards interventions that target, the downstream, the consumer. But I do think that is a really important area to target when it comes to building public support and acceptability. And I think that is particularly important because one of the key barriers for policymakers and for government is the fact that in order to obviously create policy, you need a strong mandate to do so. And while I mentioned earlier that there's a general mandate for more help, specifically in terms of what policies there's a mandate for is still a bit obscure. So recently, BIT undertook some research looking at what we define as pretty polarizing policies. And these weren't specific to the food sector, by the way, or diets. They spanned across EV adoption, planning permission for green infrastructure, etc. But of course, what is most relevant to today's talk is the food policies we trialed. And so what we did was we had an online sample, and this sample was basically split to see one version of these 5 different policies represented by each bar on this slide. And just to walk you through those before I start interpreting some of the results, what we wanted to do here was look at people's general support for starting with a meat and dairy tax, which was our control. It was what we compared each different policy to ultimately in our analysis. We then had this bar called support for domestic farmers. That was a policy that was building on the meat and dairy tax. So there'd still be a meat and dairy tax in place, but the revenue would be redistributed to support farmers in encouraging them to uptake of more sustainable farming practices. So really, it's trying to see the palatability of what that revenue redistribution point does in terms of increasing palatability of policy. And then we had a series of policy alternatives. So one of those, for instance, was the introduction of supermarket targets. So the government would introduce targets for individual retailers, and then they would basically be at their own, up to their own sort of devices in terms of what they'd propose, and basically rely on the market to innovate potential solutions. We had another policy which was cutting grants for meat and dairy, so essentially removing subsidies and redistributing this to, for instance, R&D or more sustainable agricultural food production. And then lastly, we had a bit of an outlier policy, very different to all the others, which was more around information provision through this idea of carbon labeling. And what we found, as you can see through the slides, is that generally support obviously builds as you build on that control policy. Support is very low for something like a meat and dairy tax. The revenue redistribution point adds a bit of positive support towards that policy, which is a very interesting finding for policymakers to potentially apply when they're thinking about creating more palatable policies for the general public. But obviously, as we go further through to the right, ultimately, what is most palatable to the public based on our findings is the meat and dairy labelling. And if we just go to the last slide here in the section, Lauren, what this key takeaway really is that, yes, there is a mandate for change, but what policymakers still need to navigate is this sort of tension that exists in terms of that mandate from the public, because punitive measures or measures that raise concerns around fairness or have direct impacts on the individual, like a meat and dairy tax, which is on the consumer to ultimately pay, is still viewed in a very negative light by the general public. And that's perhaps not surprising given the current financial climate. Having said that, though, there are elements of policy that people are certainly more warm to, and what these findings suggest from that example I just shared is that, for instance, information provision within the choice architecture, so for instance, the introduction of some sort of standardized carbon labeling on food products and a mandate for that to be scaled across the UK, actually is something that many people are open to and something for policymakers to consider. So sorry for taking a bit longer. I now wanted to hand back over to Lauren, who's going to run through some case study examples from our work.
Thanks so much, Ed. I'm mindful of time and want us to kind of, allow enough time for discussion and questions. There's lots of interesting comments coming through in the chat, so do keep those coming. Just want to spend the last few minutes walking us through some of our research, but very much position it from a lens of imagining what a society would look like where sustainable diets are promoted. So quite an idealistic positioning. So starting with the first example, for each of these, I'm going to kind of link back as well to what part of the model, the systems model, they may intervene. So firstly, imagining a society would look like if plant-based options, naming conventions were optimized to increase appeal. So we're starting here with more kind of traditional, conventional downstream intervention, where reframing strategies to alter preferences for plant-based dishes. Okay, so we ran a series of online experiments on sustainable food consumption with the World Resources Institute to explore how language might be used to encourage non-vegetarians to choose plant-based options from food service providers. We found that when describing food as field-grown rather than meat-free, roughly doubled self-reported ordering rates of vegetarian items. And these results have since been replicated in the field as well, trialed by Sainsbury's grocery stores and through partnership with WRI. Moving us on then to looking more at the midstream level and think about how we can target interventions at the environmental level, but also potentially have impacts on other actors at this level as well. So let's imagine a society where if plant-based options were abundant, salient, and normalised in our consumption environment. So what we did here was conduct a randomised controlled trial field experiment across 12 schools to test our solutions. And we also conducted a supplementary online survey of student perceptions on sustainable foods. We tested a number of interventions to promote plant-based meal choices, and some of these included increasing the availability of sustainable and healthy dishes. So we introduced 8 new low-carbon future food menu items, and 6 of these new meal items were vegetarian or vegan, while 2 of them contained reduced meat with a substitution of plant-based ingredients. And these dishes were dropped into school dining environment menus twice weekly. We also tested changes to meal positioning on dining environment counters. So by positioning all meat-free meals closest to the front of queues and positioning meat dishes furthest away from the front of queues. And this meant that students saw the healthy, more sustainable options first when they approached the counters. So what did we find? We found that our solutions significantly increased uptake of sustainable and healthy meal choices in schools. The promotion of meat-free meals chosen by students increased by 9.4 percentage points compared to schools in our control group. Notably, however, we also conducted some follow-up research to determine whether menu availability would influence the decision-making amongst primary actors at the midstream level, i.e. the staff making the menu procurement decisions, so those who just decide what the menus will look like and what food items to buy for the diners. Here we found the supplier increased the proportion of meat-free meals made available from schools from 30 to 50% of total meals offered. So in turn, schools made their fresh selections in the new term, and we evaluated whether this made any difference by offering more items. And really interesting, we actually found no evidence that this changes in suppliers' menu changes impacted the proportion of meat-free dishes served by schools. So this does suggest that simply increasing the availability of meat-free meals or plant-based options is insufficient, potentially. Decisions may also face other barriers such as misperceptions and cognitive biases, or there may be characteristics of the school decision-making process itself that is simply rigid and difficult to change. Just to walk us through the third example, again, looking at midstream intervention, but in an online environment. So here we ran, again, a series of online experiments to nudge people to choose smaller portion sizes in a simulated online delivery platform. This bespoke platform simulated the experience of ordering on a food delivery app and included 5 cuisine types, 15 restaurants, and 381 food and drink items. And we tested whether the portion sizes shown to participants impacted the calorie content of people's orders. And really interestingly, we found when we showed the restaurants and the food options with fewer calories in first, this reduced the amount of calories per order that our participants selected. And finally, just want to flag in terms of upstream interventions as well, and recap an example sort of briefly mentioned by Ed, where we leverage upstream levers such as the sugar tax, and we find impacts to not only decrease the number of sugary drinks bought, so at the downstream level, but it also influences the midstream level particularly the manufacturers, to produce lower sugary drinks. You can almost coin this as a bit of a double nudge. In this case, even the people who don't care about the price of sugary drinks are still drinking less sugar. So a real success. We've now got just over 20 minutes or so left for a Q&A. So yeah, really looking forward to opening up for questions.
Thanks, Lauren. If you can stop sharing your screen, that'd be great. Thank you. Thanks everyone for all your messages. A very lively chat going on, and we've got lots of questions. I wanted to just to kick us off there, I wanted to just draw on some of the comments that are being made, and some things in the presentation. It feels like there's lots of, in my mind watching that, it feels like there's lots of things that don't, I think from a policymaker's perspective, it feels almost a bit confusing as to what to do, because like you've shown, people are more receptive to doing making low impact changes. And there's a lot of comment about labelling, for example, and how people were much more open to an intervention that was around labelling rather than anything that was seen as sort of punitive. But we also know that labelling is probably like less effective, I'm guessing, than, well, lots of people on here are saying labelling is a lot less effective. At the same time, we've got, like you said at the beginning, something like 86% of people were saying that they really wanted leadership on all of this, and they really wanted government intervention. So it feels like we've got two separate things here. We feel like we've got the public saying they really want leadership and government intervention, but then actually when they're presented with options, they want something quite soft. Is that, I'm just taking that as what I've taken from there, but Ed, you've got your hand up, are you able to answer that? Where does that leave policymakers, trying to have really impactful intervention on all of this?
That's exactly the tension that exists. And I raised my hand originally to address the points made in the chat around carbon labeling, and it's one thing that perhaps I should have articulated a bit more clearly. But yes, Jez, to go to your point, it's a tension between striking that balance of what is acceptable versus what's going to make meaningful impact. And I think thinking pragmatically about it, it's a gradual change. It's things that, what is deemed acceptable within a certain period of time will shift, but that happens gradually. That doesn't happen immediately. And we're aware of the risks for an acting government, for instance, in introducing something that's widespread, going to be against sort of the public will, in a sense. One thing I was just going to mention, though, on carbon labeling, I should have made this point clearer. Carbon labeling interventions have, in my opinion, a dual effect, one of which is information provision on a consumer. And you can argue that consumers don't pay attention to those, they don't have effects. There's evidence that suggests they do have effects in certain situations and circumstances, and we've done research into that. And also I'd argue that there are certainly varying types of carbon labels, some that are poorly designed, some that are better designed, and when they're optimally designed, they can have more effects on information provision, people noticing them, taking them into account. But the second mechanism through which labeling is effective is actually a market mechanism. If it's something that consumers start paying attention to and being visible to consumers, then that incentivizes the market to acknowledge that and potentially compete on the carbon scores of their given products. Now, it's not as simple as just that, but there were quite a few messages that were aimed specifically at the consumer impact. But I just wanted to make clear that with labeling, it's something that actually has that upstream level intervention impact as well, which shouldn't be neglected.
Great, thank you. I'm just picking up on this, there's a few questions around getting government action, essentially. And I guess there's a sort of bigger question of, if the majority of the public are saying that they do want government intervention, why is the perception the other way around? Like, is that purely a political thing? Like, there's something about the psychology of politicians and leadership here in terms of understanding perhaps what the public is open to. I wonder if you guys have got any comments on that.
I didn't quite grasp the question, sorry, Jez. Would you mind just repeating that?
Yeah, sorry. So there are a few comments and questions around how to actually get the government to take action. And I'm sort of saying that if like your figures show that a lot of people, the majority of the public wants government action, why has there been this perception amongst politicians that the public really doesn't want them to do anything, doesn't want any intervention, and it's like such a kind of political no-go zone? And is there something about the psychology of politicians themselves in all of this? Like, what's going on there?
I think that is a good question. I think there's definitely risk aversion. We're all risk averse, and I think that can be extended to politicians as well. One of the things that I was going to mention on that is that what we find typically is that at superficial levels, people will be very willing, very accepting of certain policies. But it's when you start drilling down into the specific detail that people maybe start having some apprehension. One of the things that was picked up in the chat, though, is that I think the methodology used does matter, as was correctly pointed out by one of the attendees. Our findings in that case were survey findings. When you're running a survey, you don't have the opportunity to properly deep dive into policies in great amounts of detail. We did do focus groups alongside that research, but again, you sort of lose that detail that might make people more willing to come on board. And increasingly now, what we're seeing is instances of public deliberation, more involved focus groups, deliberative fora, which are seen as ways of developing policy hand in hand with citizens and the public. And I think there's a key thing to point out there in terms of agency. People feel like they have more agency in the process. They feel like their voices are being heard. And through those sorts of deliberative fora, we typically see findings that people are more willing and accepting of the changes that result in terms of policy outcomes, if that's the focus of the session. So that is a very valid point, and something that I think my personal opinion is government should explore more as a means of actually policy making and design, because it really brings the public into the agenda in terms of design.
Just picking up on that then, I know we were talking about this a little bit before we started the webinar, but do you get a sense at all at this point whether there's going to be any more openness within this government to looking at all of this and doing away potentially with that sort of fear around, the perception of the nanny state, let's say?
I think it remains to be seen. I can't really comment because I don't know what will come. I do welcome sort of focus on sustainable diets and wider decarbonisation agenda, and I think that may happen over the coming months and years, but I think it remains to be seen, really. But I do certainly think that more research, as I mentioned, with the public, more involved research, again with deliberative fora, I think those research methods are what is really going to get to the crux of what is more palatable, what can be positioned at a degree of high acceptability. I think that should be done more, because even in BIT's own history, we've relied quite a bit on, for instance, primary research via surveys, interviews, etc. But actually bringing people into the process of solutionizing, I think, is a really helpful approach.
I think this follows through to industry as well. There've been some comments and questions around that, and whether there's a role here for behavioural change in addressing it in for decision makers in, say, like retailers, feed manufacturers, at that sort of level. Is that something that you think has any has legs, basically, has any potential, and how do you do that as well?
And sorry, Jez, is that sort of intervening specifically at those levels?
Yeah, so if there's a way of, so the question I saw was around, or comment was around, what about using behavioural insight, behavioural change
Yeah.
insight to shift behaviours and decision making within companies, so within retailers, within food manufacturers, to drive more
Yeah.
sustainable and healthy actions, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's similarly to consumers, it's not too different. Ultimately, there are more complex decision networks within organizations and markets. But ultimately, the same things apply. I think you need a bit of carrot and stick, and that applies across the board. You need to design a system where organizations are incentivized to behave in a certain way. And yes, there is an aspect as well of individualized leadership within organizations that you could potentially target as well. But again, in that case, you're still sort of narrowing down the scope of intervention a bit. I think one of the benefits of going further upstream, as we said, is how can we increase the potential scale of intervention? I think it's more through market changes, market shifts, versus targeting individual decision makers, for example.
Okay. Going back to our first question from Seamus Stouch, I think it's a really interesting question actually, is how much does the loss of connection to nature and food production impact disconnect from healthy food?
I'm not sure I quite understand the question, if I'm honest.
Well, it's sort of talking about, I guess, how much, we know a lot of people are disconnected from nature and
Yeah,
from the way that their food's produced. So he's sort of asking, does that have an impact on the choices that we're making?
see.
And therefore, I guess in terms of our choices for the environment, for our health, that kind of thing. Oh, Lauren's got her hand up. Lauren, did you want to come in on this?
Yeah, happy to come in. So I guess this comes back to some of the narrative Ed was discussing in that systems section, that ultimately at the downstream level, it's important to be kind of building public acceptability and understanding and awareness of choices, but that can potentially only take us so far. So while it's certainly an important aspect to kind of combine with other interventions at higher levels, I think ultimately if we're looking to see a big shift in the types of dietary choices we're making, it's not going to be enough just to educate our public. That's really important to bring them along so there isn't that resistance and reactance, and ultimately linking back to some of that discussion on persuading our political leaders to take action as well. If they're convinced this is what the public are kind of supportive of, then that kind of ticks their box as well. So I think we need to see this as ultimately a system opportunity, and I appreciate that is complex, but I think measures at any level are not going to be sufficient. We need to look across and identify those complementary measures at different levels of the system too.
Thank you. I'm going to go to it's quite a long question here, but sort of comment and question from someone called Rebecca Gregson. She's saying research on individual behaviour change need not limit itself to a focus on how to persuade meat eaters to adopt plant-based diets. Instead, we might think about how to harness social contagion, asking the question, do plant-based eaters influence members of their social networks, i.e. family, partners, friends, etc.? She says, I'm a social psychologist working on the contagion of plant-based diets through social systems. How do these processes fit into your upstream, downstream model of behavioural change? And she says, I ask this question because I would really welcome some insights on how my work might be of value to policymakers and organisations like BIT. That's a great question. Thanks, Rebecca. Ed or Lauren, best to answer.
Did you want to take this one, Lauren?
Yeah, happy to kick off, and then Ed, you can always jump in with any reflections. So I think it's a really important point that Rebecca flags, actually. Thank you for flagging this. So even focusing in on sort of individual actors, regardless of what level those actors may exist in the system the narrative that we're building today, ultimately the social environment, so people's networks, their family, their friends, the people that they see kind of similar to them, ultimately have really important roles on shaping kind of preferences and what kind of behaviour cues that people pick up from those social environments to inform their own. However, it is within the limits of this downstream that we have been discussing. So while it's really important to kind of build that kind of and position sustainable diets, if we are to promote them as normative options, and that could be through everything from subtle cues in supermarket shelves, the fact that more plant-based options are available, or when we're looking through recipe books, there is a greater proportion of plant-based options and menu recipes available. That signals that they are a popular choice, that others are doing it. While we also look at kind of narratives that can be built in the social environment too, influential speakers through to close networks. And the degree to which those networks are supportive or resist these desired behaviours can really then affect what that individual may choose to do. So yes, we should be very much kind of shaping the conversation as these things be growing in popularity and flagging that. I don't know if there's anything specific you wanted to add.
I was just quickly going to say it's really interesting research, and I think when that happens at scale, social contagion, and you reach some sort of tipping point, that's exactly the type of wide scale change you can achieve in terms of interventions to encourage social contagion. It's quite tricky when you go outside of your immediate sort of locus and group. But I'd love to hear more about that because I personally I'm not the most up to speed with that specific research. But certainly, if we can shift the narrative as a social as a even at a social level, social norm level, then we are going to see shifts. There are a lot of sort of misperceptions around, for instance, having more plant-based diets at the expense of reducing meat intake, for instance, misperceptions about nutritional value, misperceptions about satiation after eating, and I think these are the types of things that actually would go a long way and could be addressed through those social aspects. But obviously, yeah, other things obviously need to be done as well in terms of recalibrating markets.
Thank you. I just want to move us more toward mid and upstream factors that you were talking about earlier. There's a question here, which I think is a really, really, really important question that we've not addressed really today, and I think we need to, is are these kinds of discussions about changing individual choice options, etc., a distraction from highlighting and addressing the most important barrier, which is corporate power and interest? We cannot change the food environment without addressing this. And so I guess the question really is around how on earth do we tackle that issue, especially given huge sort of lobbying power and interests, and the influence of that on sort of policy change.
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's a tricky one to answer because, yes, I mean, absolutely is needed. What you need is a recalibration of incentivizing organizations to act in the interest. And ideally, there are, parallels between acting more sustainably and commercial incentive as well. That's obviously the ideal. It's maybe a utopia, but that's the spot that needs to be hit. I think government, there is certainly scope for more to be done from government in terms of mandate and some regulation. But yeah, it is a really tricky question to tackle because it's so multifaceted. But yeah, absolutely. That I think the very emphasis on our model of upstream intervention is let's not forget about the big actors upstream, which are ultimately, they're the ones that have a huge, huge say on the choices available to us and ultimately, what we eat.
I think just to end, I'm going to go to a question from Effie Warwick John, which is a great question. If you had a magic wand, what top 3 interventions would you have in terms of maximum impact, policy and non-policy related? I go to both of you. If you have 3 each, maximum intervention, maximum impact. Sorry.
I think defaults are really powerful. I mean, the behavioral science literature sort of bears that out. So I would look to apply defaults that default towards a selection or choice of plant-based foods as much as possible within our shopping, our retail, our hospitality environments. So that comes down to the positioning, the real estate that's occupied by certain options within stores, the positioning of options. And I think that would go a long, long way in terms of changing individual choice. Then further upstream, it's a different conversation. It's more around incentivization, disincentivization, what subsidies can be applied, for instance, to encourage sustainable produce, plant-based produce as well, and the practices that surround that. I've given quite a vague answer there, but I'd focus primarily on defaults for behavior change and leveraging those in the choice environment, and then revisiting incentives and disincentives within markets.
Nice, thank you. Lauren, did you have any? What would be your top 3 for impact?
I think defaults is a great one, but I think my mind immediately sort of went to what levers can we pull to shape the right kind of commercial incentives? So very much thinking about how we can create more available options and normalize these options at the point of purchase, so that they just become the kind of natural point at which consumers move towards. But ultimately that needs to influence our midstream actors, so those who are procuring the goods, and I think through them signaling an increase in demand, right, that will trickle on to our producers, the ones that actually generate the goods, and incentivize them to invest more in the relevant categories.
What about incentivizing the way that that companies make money, and so changing the regulatory system so that companies are making money a different way, or in terms of how food is costed based on whether it's healthy or sustainable or not?
So I think you're potentially describing a carbon tax there, Jez, which yes, could have potential. I think there's something there around the impact that has on the consumer and whether any price increases would be passed down and the implications that would have on sort of resistance to change. So would need to be considered further before implementation. But in a hypothetical world, certainly a really good kind of straightforward way of incentivizing what our commercial bodies do.
We need to wrap up, but I think there's just one thing that I've seen coming up quite a lot that I think we need to address, which is the issue that food is complex. Choosing the right thing, for sustainable, ethical, etc., health benefits, all these things, it's really complex, and it's not just a black and white thing of less meat and dairy and more plants. Like, it's more complex than that. And because it's so complicated, I guess, does that add like an extra challenge, or how how is that complexity kind of overcome when communicating things to the public, and also to decision makers, whether that's in as procurement people, or whether it are policymakers?
Just really quickly, I think it's about breaking down the problem and having some degree of prioritization of the different parts of the problem and starting from the top and working down. The system is inherently complex and can't be tackled all at once.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, thank you both very much. That was really interesting. It's been a really lively chat. I don't think we've ever had such a lively chat box. So thank you everybody for all your thoughts, inputs. It's a kind of really tricky topic, I think, and I think the chat box just shows how much of it is also based on there's also a lot of different opinions and perspectives, I think, in all of this. So one to continue kind of trying to understand and unravel and everything. But yeah, thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Ed. Super interesting. We will be putting the video of this on the website and on YouTube in the next couple of days. I will email it out to everybody, so if you want to watch it again. I will also put links in the chat in a second for various different things. Just also have a look at our resource hub. We've got the whole back catalogue of webinars on there, plus briefings and digests, all those sorts of things. And also, I'd be really grateful if people could take just like a couple of minutes to rate this webinar. AFN funding runs out at the end of next year, or it's due to at the moment. So it would really help us kind of make the case for continuing in some way. So I will add that link as well. But otherwise, thank you very much, everybody. Sorry we not got through all your questions. There've been absolutely tons. I might see if I can pick out some more and maybe ask Ed and Lauren if they'd answer a few more on email or something, and I can send around. But yeah, thank you all very much, and see you soon. Our next one is in about 3 weeks' time. So I will share the links in the chat now.
Thank you all.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Thanks, Ed. Thanks, Lauren.
Yes, thank you, Ed and Lauren. Thanks.